Hello, I'm Scott Gartner, Director of the Penn State School of International Affairs, and I want to thank you for watching this discussion about cheap surrender and costly victory, wars of error, and the victory trap. I'm going to start today with a proposition, and that is much of today's terrorism is inextricably linked to mistaken decisions to start war. Therefore, a critical aspect of counterterrorism is helping decision makers to make better decisions about what wars to start. Let's begin with a puzzle. Think about the United States. Why did the American quick and decisive victories in Iraq and Afghanistan become long and costly occupations? America is the most powerful country in the world. It has a military defense budget, depending on how you measure it, equal to the next 7 or 10 highest military budgets put together, or even equal to the rest of the world put together. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries. The United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001 with the idea of going in, defeating the ruling Taliban, and getting out in a matter of months. How could the United States still be there from December 2001 until today? Similarly, the United States thought it would go into Iraq, defeat Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath regime, and come out, and very few Americans would die. 5,000 Americans die. How could that be? What mistakes were made? Some we know. There was a lack of American planning. There was a failure among American policymakers and even some in the military to understand differences of culture, religious schisms, Shia, Sunni, wasn't as well understood by American military personnel and civilians at that time as it is today. There was poor military intelligence in both Afghanistan and Iraq. There were not enough troops in the initial invasions, particularly of Iraq. Perhaps a sense of arrogance among America because it was so powerful. And there was some bad political decision making. I think all of these factors are correct. I'm not going to challenge any of them. I am, however, can add an additional factor that you may not have thought of. And that is what made going to war against Afghanistan and Iraq attractive for the United States is the same factor that made the wars long and costly for the United States. Now, the basic idea that connects those two, the decision to invade and the long, costly occupation, the basic idea is very simple and very well understood. And that symbol, and that notion, is that winning a battle is insufficient for winning the war. Wars are instrumental. They're tools designed to obtain a political outcome. Wars are not the ends in themselves. And even within the war, the first battle is not as important as the last battle. We know this as far back as Sun Tzu and as recently as publications today. Winning the battle is not enough. You have to win the political change. That's the key argument here. In this talk, I hope to identify 4 key factors for you. First, what's the role of wartime institutions? Second, I want to show how there's a dynamic link between the factors that contribute to wartime initiation and wartime outcomes. Third, I'm going to introduce a new concept called the theory of costly victory and compare that to another new concept called the theory of cheap surrender. Finally, I'm going to put them together in a new argument, a new conceptualization that's the theory of victory traps and wars of error. Let's begin with the concept of a strong state. Strong states have full control over their territories. They successfully provide their citizens with high-quality political goods. They perform well. They have peaceful leadership transitions. They have institutional resilience to shocks. Think about the terrific shocks that India has dealt with in its history assassinations, wars, and yet there's still peaceful leadership transitions. Strong states have high legitimacy. You might disagree with the leader, but you recognize that the leader of the state is legitimate. They have extensive merit-based bureaucracies. If you're studying for the civil service exam, you're studying hard because you know a high score will help you to get in. That's merit-based. It's not just who your parents are, it's how well you do. All of which makes strong states work. Examples such as India, America, Germany, and New Zealand. Now, it's critical here, we're not talking about big states or powerful states. I lived in New Zealand. It's an incredibly wonderful state. It's smaller than Pune in terms of size of its population. It's got roughly 2 million people, 1 million of whom live in Auckland. It's a wonderful place. I encourage you to visit. But it is not a powerful state. It does not have a powerful military in terms of the rest of the world. But it is a strong state. It has strong institutions. That's what I'm talking about. So that's how New Zealand and America can be considered the same. It's this institutional strength, not the country's power that we're talking about here. Let's contrast that with weak states. Weak states have feeble government capacity. They have low legitimacy. They don't perform well. They have high levels of corruption. They have poorly implemented rules of law. Frequently, people in weak states introduce themselves first with another group and then second with the group identity. In other words, the national identity is second in people's identity. It's not first. It's not the way they think of themselves. These states are vulnerable to crises. They lack institutional resiliency. Put simply, weak states don't work so well. Examples, unfortunately for India, include Pakistan and Bangladesh, neighbors, as well as countries like Sierra Leone. Now, weak states are problematic, but they're not the worst. They're not the weakest. The weakest states are failed states. They're the weakest of all. These are states that are almost more places on a map than functioning institutions. In these states, the government has no political authority. The government, the institutions are unable to fulfill the basic responsibilities of a sovereign state. They have a loss of control over their borders. They don't control who comes in, who goes out, what comes in, what goes out. They have an inability to provide public services. In these states, they're in constant crisis. Examples of failed states would include Somalia, Afghanistan, the Sudan, Haiti, Yemen. These are states that they're not having problems working, they've stopped working. They've stopped working. We can take these states and we could put them on a continuum from strong states here, such as America, Germany, New Zealand, I would argue India, all the way over to weak states and then failed states, such as Somalia, the Sudan. We could think about that continuum, and that's going to be critical for where we want to go in terms of thinking about the victory trap. Now let's go on to a new concept. Let's talk about the factors that affect victory. Many of the factors that affect wartime victory are very well known. They're very established. They might be hard to obtain, but we know what they are. Their power. Big, powerful states are more likely to win wars. Resolve. States that are committed to the objective are more likely to win wars. Strategy matters. Clarity of the objective. What are you trying to achieve? And is it the destruction of something, the elimination of something, such as kicking Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait? That's comparatively easy to say, changing people's minds. That's very challenging. Researchers showed that's tough. Material advantage, more troops, more tanks, more planes, more likelihood of winning. And then troop quality. A country like Israel is very small, has a material disadvantage compared to many of its adversaries, but it has very high military troop quality. I'm going to add a new concept to this theory of victory. It's initiator and target institutional capacity. How strong the institutions are of the initiator and the target. Strong in terms of weak state and strong state. So let's put these together. Institutional capacity, if it's high, then you could think about it as like squeezing an orange. If you have high institutional capacity, the government is good at squeezing all the resources out of the country. So states of high levels of institutional capacity can create and direct powerful militaries. Israel can create and direct a powerful military because it's a strong state. Even though it's a small state, it's a strong state in terms of its institutions. Nigeria, which is roughly, 150 times larger than Israel? 50 times larger than Israel? Can't put together as powerful a military because its institutions are much weaker. If you have low institutional capacity, therefore, you're unable to convert resources into disciplined militaries. The institutions tend to be only as competent as the current leaders. If you have a great leader, then maybe you have a pretty decent institution. And if that leader is killed or somehow dies or leaves or is promoted up to another institution, then your institution may fail with the new person. When cut off from command, control, communications, and intelligence, low institutional capacity state military forces tend to be kind of useless. They don't know what to do. They need to be told all the time what to do. Now let's go bring in another factor that's going to be critical for our discussion here, and that is, why do states go to war? What are some wartime initiation factors? They go to war because there's a grievance, a factor that is upsetting people, an issue. There's a belief that military force is critical for obtaining solution to that grievance, the answer you want. There's a belief in quick and decisive victory, in certain victory, an area I've done some research on, and most importantly, in low-cost victory. I'm going to talk about this a lot because this also reflects a lot of my own research, so I feel that I can convey some nuances about the role of low-cost victory to you. When states go to war, citizen military dead are the most critical factor. The most critical factor. The death of your soldiers, sailors, air personnel. We need to keep in mind that militaries are different than any other type of organization. As a teacher, if I tell the provost, oh, I had a good last week, as director of my school, I only lost 2 students, the provost would not be happy. That'd be terrible. That would be terrible. Directors of schools don't lose students. That's not acceptable. Militaries represent the only type of business, the only type of organization, the only type of function where people dying is part of the job. A military, 2 militaries might meet. One military might do everything right. The other military might do everything wrong. And when they go to war, people on both sides die, even though the one military did everything right. When you go to war, when you use military force, people die. Citizens, soldiers, military personnel, sailors, air personnel, unfortunately die. It's the nature of war. It's what separates it from every other government function. Citizen military dead represent the ultimate citizen cost. Our normative views of it are very clear. We don't want our citizens to die. They're visible since World War I in villages. The number of military dead were posted in villages all over, say, in India, New Zealand, Great Britain, the United States. Today, they're posted on the internet. We could see them, we know about them, we read about them. As I said, they're unique. They don't exist in other types of government organizations. We also can compare them. We could talk about India's losses in World War I versus 1965, and then America's losses in the Vietnam War in the 60s versus India in 1965. And that's meaningful with a lot of other factors we can't compare across space and time. Research that my colleague and I have done has shown that wartime casualties affect elections, public opinion, elite decision-making, news coverage, and beliefs about victory. Wartime casualties are the most important factor we have found in affecting all of these critical factors, all of these critical political functions. Leaders know that. Leaders don't want to lose elections. They don't want public opinion to turn against them or their policy. They don't want to have an assembly that has alternative views to them. They don't want the news coverage to be critical of them, and they want the population to believe that they're going to win. As a result, leaders try to minimize casualties because they know if casualties rise, if they increase, then they're likely to lose the election, have public opinion go against them, have their colleagues hold views in contrast to them, have negative news coverage, and have the population believe that the war is lost. So as a result, they try to minimize wartime casualties. That's going to be critical for the story as we put it all together. So leaders before a war try to take in everything that we've talked about, and do some type of strategic assessment. And they do that during the war as well. It's very difficult to do. It's very challenging. So I wrote a book on it called Strategic Assessment in War. And the book talks about how hard this challenge is. One way to think about it is imagine a game of football, what we call soccer in America. And imagine you're trying to make a strategic choice. And perhaps the simplest and most important strategic choice is, do you pull the goalie? Are you going to pull the goalie? You only pull the goalie if there's maybe, 30 seconds, a minute left, and you're down by, say, a point. It doesn't make sense otherwise. Certainly you don't pull the goalie at the beginning of the game, and you don't pull the goalie if you're up by 10 points, 3 points. So imagine playing soccer, playing football, and not being able to see the score, and being asked, is it time to pull the goalie? How would you know? How would you know? That's what war is. We don't know the score ex ante, before the fact. We only know the score ex post, after the fact. After the fact, it's easy to figure out what worked, what didn't work, what was the right thing to do, and what was the wrong thing to do. Ex ante, it's very difficult to figure that out. Before the war, before key decisions have to be made, it's hard to figure that out. As a result, pre-war thinking tends to focus on the most concrete things, what's easy to see, and that is the initial battles and the initial military requirements and military objectives. So pre-war thinking is going to focus on these initial conditions. So now let's start putting it all together. Weak states have a high certainty of defeat. When you take on a weak state, you have expectation of low costs, but victory provides no assistance to occupation. The good news, you defeated Afghanistan. The bad news, you got Afghanistan. What's Afghanistan going to do for you? The government is very weak. It's a failed state. It can't do anything for itself, let alone for you, the United States, as an occupier. You buy very little with your victory. Let's contrast that with strong states. Okay? So strong states have low certainty of defeat. They have an expectation of high costs when you take them on. But when you defeat them, victory is going to provide assistance to occupation. Let me give you some examples and be clear on that as we go through this. Costly victory creates low-cost occupations. Victory over a strong state is hard. You have high initial costs, many initiator casualties. The war might be unpopular. Winston Churchill lost his re-election after World War II. But you buy something by paying that cost. You get the strong state. The state apparatus provides support for occupation. The occupied strong state is able to control its former military forces, control its population, provide public goods, convert from war to peace, and satisfy public needs. This is a picture of Emperor Hirohito of Japan, the leader during and immediately after World War II. Think about how hard it was for America to defeat the Japanese. They had to drop not one, but 2 atom bombs on the Japanese. Think about how motivated the Japanese were. Prior to the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the Battle of Okinawa, the costliest battle for the Americans of the war. Women and children were jumping off cliffs to their death rather than be part of the occupied forces of the United States during the war. In other words, the Japanese people were incredibly committed to a ferocious ideology of fighting the Americans. And yet, when Emperor Hirohito surrendered, the Japanese state, government, and people supported the American occupation. Total change in behavior. That's costly victory. Let's contrast that with cheap surrender. Victory over a weak state creates low initial costs. It's easy. It's a weak state. It can't marshal a lot of strength and capabilities. Few initiator casualties, so the war is initially quite popular. But the defeated state apparatus provides no support for the occupation. The occupied weak state is unable to control former military forces, its own population. It's unable to provide public goods. It's unable to convert society from war to peace. It's unable to satisfy public needs. This creates 2 critical problems. First, it's the creation of public goods, control of the population, control of military forces. All of this is critical, absolutely critical to determining wartime occupation, whether it will lead to rebellion and guerrilla war and resistance, and then later terrorism, or peace. So the weak state creates exactly the conditions that are undesirable, that are likely to lead to rebellion, that are likely to lead to continued wartime occupation, violent occupation, deaths for the occupier, and terrorism. At the same time, counterterrorism experts will tell you the most critical factor in effective counterterrorism in these types of situations is having control and support of the state and its military. And there's no ally here. There's no local ally to help in counterterrorism. So you have the conditions that breed rebellion and terrorism, and you don't have the key tool, which is a local ally that you use to redress and put down rebellion and terrorism. So the worst of both worlds. So this is the idea of the victory trap. If you go to war focusing only on low initial costs, only low initial costs and victory, and as a result you attack a weak state, you're likely to get stuck in a long, costly occupation for which you lack the political will, resources, strategies, and effective local state institutions to put down rebellion and terrorism. So this is a problem. This is the victory trap. Now, if you go to war with a weak state, recognizing that the initial defeat will be easy, and that there'll be a long occupation, and that'll be costly, and you take those costs into account, and you're willing to pay those costs, that is not the victory trap. The trap is, we don't have a lot of support back home for a costly war. We're going to go to war against this weak state because it's weak. Hey, look, we defeated them easily at low cost. Oh my gosh, we're caught in this long, costly, violent occupation. we're trapped in. How do we get out? We're facilitating emergence of rebellion and terrorism, and we don't have the critical tool of a local ally to help us. That's the victory trap. Let me give you an example of contrasting these two concepts. When you take on the Third Reich, you realize you're going to pay high costs. America lost 400,000 American soldiers in World War II, fighting Germany and Japan. The Soviet Union lost 20 million people, soldiers and civilians, fighting against Nazi Germany. Tremendously high costs, unbelievably high. Think how motivated, how animated by the Nazi ideology the German people were. In the Battle of Berlin, weeks before the end of the war, everybody knew that Germany had lost. And yet, when asked, German youth, women, disabled people, when asked to go out and fight, they saluted, said yes sir, and went out and fought. And who did they fight? They fought the Red Army, the Soviet Union Army, the largest army in the history of the world, still to this day, the largest army, the most powerful army in World War II, more powerful than the American army, a vicious army, a ferocious army. These children of 12, disabled people, elderly people, went out and fought, and they died. They died in the Battle of Berlin at incredibly high numbers, high percentages, as they knew they would. But that's how animated they were by the Nazi ideology. And yet when the surrender came, and remember, the surrender was not done by Hitler. It was done by Admiral Donitz. Many of you maybe have never heard of Admiral Donitz. When Admiral Donitz, and many Germans at the time hadn't heard of Admiral Donitz. When Admiral Donitz surrendered, these same women, children, disabled people, the men in the military and the Wehrmacht put down their guns, picked up their shovel, and started cleaning and fixing Germany. Despite being motivated by an ideology that was just as ferocious, and they were committed to just as fervently as ISIS or any other ideology. That's a strong state. The strong state said, we lost, we're done, now we're going to support the victors. And people said, okay. America lost 400,000 people fighting the Japanese and the Nazis in occupation. It lost 0 people. No Americans died. Let's compare that with Afghanistan and Iraq. The Afghanistan state, when the United States 1,200 Special Operations Forces, about 100 donkeys, and support from local militias invaded the Afghanistan state, the Afghanistan state just disintegrated. It just disappeared. The Iraq, because it was a weak state, it was a failed state. The Iraq state was a weak state, not a failed state. When the United States easily defeated Iraq, there was still a state apparatus then. The Americans then made 2 decisions that converted Iraq from a weak state to a failed state. First, they eliminated leaders in government who were members of the Ba'ath Party. These are the people who ran the dams, who ran the electrical grid, who cut the Social Security checks to keep elderly from starving, who kept the electricity going, the roads going. It kicked all those people out. The institutions, because it's a weak state, were not sufficiently resilient to lose an entire leadership level across the board, and those institutions crumbled. At the same time, the United States disbanded the Iraqi military. This did 2 things. It took away the most powerful institution in the state, helping the state to transform from a weak state to a failed state, and it put millions of angry Iraqis with military training out on the streets, and then many of whom went into Syria, Jordan, and particularly those in Syria or Western Iraq contributed to ISIS. Always a bad idea to disband a military something like that, you're creating enemies who have military training. Okay? Very different from Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, where the state was powerful foe during the war and a powerful ally after the war. Afghanistan just crumbled. Iraq could have been a weak ally, but the United States made sure it too crumbled as well, unfortunately. This facilitated in both states long, costly occupations by America as they tried to recreate these institutions without the help of strong local allies. They tried to put down the rebellion that was both facilitated by the deprivation caused by eliminating what state did exist, particularly in Iraq. So people had limited power before the war. After the war, very little power. Things like that. It took years to try to get the power back up. By then, they were already angry and contributing to the rebellion. And the United States did not have local allies, the local military, that it could call on to try and address the rebellion. So it became a very, very costly situation in both states, both wars, very different from what was expected. Go in, come out, quick, low cost. December 2001, the United States still in Afghanistan. Okay, in summary, much terrorism results from errant wartime information and the initiation of wars by mistake. The cost of a conflict greatly influences public and political support. Recognizing that military actions depend, the views of those military actions depend on the costs, political leaders choose military actions when conquest is easy and low cost. Weak targets have weak institutional capacity. It makes it easy to overestimate the ease of quick victory and underestimate the long-term costs likely to occur through occupation. Cheap surrender, the defeat of a weak state, provides no assets for occupation and likely creates the seeds that are going to sprout into rebellion and terrorism. Therefore, a key aspect of counterterrorism is the accurate assessment of all war costs, a comprehensive understanding of all the costs involved when going to a war, so that you can make informed decisions. Doesn't mean you don't go to war. It means you go to war when you think and you understand the whole costs involved, you've explored non-war alternatives, and you're committed to those entire costs. You're much more likely to be successful in those situations as an initiator, and you're much less likely to plant the seeds that are going to germinate into terrorism, and you not have the ability with local allies to confront that terrorism. So, in summary, let's avoid the victory trap. Thank you very much. Now, let me do one more thing. Let me give you a brief introduction to the Penn State School of International Affairs. The Penn State School of International Affairs provides a master's program for students from around the world. 50% of our students are international, many from India. Our students come from 20 different countries. We have a 97% career placement rate over the last 4 years in governments, NGOs, private industry, IGOs, the United Nations. We allow you in the 2 years you're at the Penn State School of International Affairs to customize your curriculum so that you could study what you want. That's going to get you on the way to your global career. At the same time, you're able to draw on the tremendous resources of Penn State University, 45,000 students, one of the world's top universities. Our faculty are ambassadors, admirals, CIA and intelligence analysts, UN advisors, top authors in the field and scholars. And our alumni, international and American, are senior disaster response specialists in the American government, head of embassies around the world for different countries, United Nations employees, PhD candidates, international market leaders in industry and NGOs around the world. I very much encourage you to explore the Penn State School of International Affairs, sia.psu.edu, because it might be the right opportunity for you to get a Master's of International Affairs and start your global career. I'm Dr. Scott Sigmund Gartner, Director of the Penn State School of International Affairs. I'd like to thank you for your time. I wish you all the best.